I'm going to try to cover a great deal of ground in a relatively short time, but if I run long, please bear with me. This is a skill that is hard to teach and it's hard for students to get. A lot of times we look at a paragraph and we say, oh, I can't possibly integrate sources into a paragraph without just slinging a whole bunch of quotations in there. We've already talked about issues of summary and paraphrase earlier in the course. You've done a summary, you wrote summaries for your annotated bibliography. Now we're going to talk about how do we take that information and stick it into paragraphs. I'm going to talk first about paragraphs as a thing, and then I'm going to show you an example of how to integrate 4 different sources into one particular paragraph. So let's get started. Why do we even have paragraphs? Well, paragraphs are really designed to make life easier for the audience. You're trying to chunk text into logical sequences of sentences so that the audience can read them and understand them quicker and easier. The length of a paragraph varies a great deal, and you shouldn't get too hung up on how long a paragraph is. I'll show you the shortest paragraph I know, and then we'll look at some examples also of paragraphs that are longer and more complex. And we'll start with a little bit of history. On the left is the manuscript of Beowulf, which is the great Anglo-Saxon poem. And in those days, we wrote on something called vellum. This is a processed animal skin. So the idea of making a piece of paper, of writing something down, the first thing you had to do was bump off a sheep and then carefully scrape the hide and process it in a way that allowed it to turn into a thin writing surface like you see here. As you can see, we have periods, but that's it. There's no commas, there's no paragraphs, there's no nothing. And this, in fact, is written in verse, but because vellum was so expensive and so hard to produce, they just jammed everything together onto a page. So there's no division into spaces here, mainly because the paragraph really hadn't been invented yet. If we go over here to the right, this is a book published in 1550. It's actually kind of the Encyclopedia Britannica of the Google of its time. And this was the source for a lot of Shakespeare's plays, were Holinshed's Chronicles. Almost all of his history plays come from this particular book. As you can see, we can see paragraph indentations here, and you can see that they're different lengths. Some are just one sentence. Some are really quite long and complicated. You can also see that they have these little subheadings over here in the margin. And what that allows people to do back then was to organize information in a way that made sense to them. So this is what no paragraph world looks like. And this is just a 7th century manuscript. If you went back to biblical text, for instance, if you looked at the Bible as it was written in Greek or in Latin, you would see no paragraphs at all, mainly because they hadn't been invented. In our own time, the paragraph is largely a feature of modern printing. And printing isn't invented till 1471. Holinshed's Chronicles is published about 75 years after the invention of printing, and you can see what an organized, relatively easy to read text it is. Paragraphs are very powerful tools, and we kind of underestimate just how powerful they are. A lot of people think that paragraphs have to be 3 to 5 sentences, or 5 to 7, or 6 to 8, or some arbitrary number like that. But there's no rule. Okay, the only rule for paragraphs is they have to be indented. Here is the shortest paragraph I know. It's a complete sentence. I would. And it's from Eudora Welty's short story, or actually memoir, I apologize, called The Little Store. And what she's doing here with this one paragraph is she's dividing up what her mother's thinking and what her mother wants with what she wants or what she does. So her mother says something and she responds. And the I would is the transition between these two. Now you may think of this as just a sentence or a throwaway line, but it's in fact a real paragraph. And I always challenge students, particularly in English 101, to see if they could write a 2-word paragraph that works. I make you the same offer. If you can figure out how to make this work in your argument paper, where you've got a 2-word, complete sentence paragraph, I think you should try it. Can't hurt you. I'll tell you if I think it doesn't work or not, but it certainly won't affect your grade if you try it. But you can only try one in a paper, by the way, just in case you decide to take my challenge. Here's a way of thinking about paragraphing that actually comes from someone I have talked to, but I've never met, Chris Anderson, who's now a retired professor at Oregon State University. And he has this model that he calls the TRIAC model of a paragraph. And here he looks not at the number of sentences, but rather what is their function in a paragraph. And he talks about one sentence type being the thesis or the topic sentence. You've all heard of those kinds of sentences. A second type of sentence is what he calls a restatement or a restriction of the topic. A third kind of sentence is an information sentence. This is what he calls particulars, or what we might call facts or research or narrative. This is stuff that we know. It's information that we get from a source, or it's information from our own experience, one of those two. But these are fundamentally facts. And again, they can come from your own experience if you're writing a little narrative about why you're interested in a particular topic, or it comes from your research if you have facts or information or data that you want to include. Analysis is the fourth kind of sentence, and these are sentences that are entirely written by you. These are your ideas, your thinking, your understanding, your explanation of why a particular set of information items are contained in a paragraph. And then there's what he calls a C sentence, and he calls this a conclusion. It's just the last sentence. It could be a summary, it could be a transition, it could just simply be the last sentence. How do these look? Well, not all paragraphs first contain all five. Most body paragraphs have a topic sentence, information sentences, and analysis. Sometimes you can have entire paragraphs of information followed by an entire paragraph of analysis. Transition and summary paragraphs, where you're moving, when you're finishing one thing and you want to go on to something else, you may have you have 4 of the 5 sentence types, you may have 5, or you may have just 1. Opening paragraphs normally going to give you a topic, and they're going to give you some information. And maybe after that, you're going to see some restriction of a topic. You may start really broad and say gun control is a complex issue. There are a lot of different points of view on it. We've been talking about this for 200 years. And then you're going to say, but I'm going to focus specifically on background checks. That's a restriction sentence. And then you're going to explain why background checks, and then come to some kind of conclusion in another paragraph. Okay. Again, there's no fixed rules in terms of length. 2 sentences, 1 sentence, 7 sentences, those are all possible paragraph lengths. And as we've seen, even a 2-word paragraph can be helpful. But those are the most dangerous paragraphs of all. Okay, let's see how this might work. Something else to consider is a balance, where every piece of information has to have some kind of analysis, some kind of explanation of why it's there. It doesn't require an equal number of I and A sentences, but it does require that all facts be accounted for by your thinking. And I'll show you a sample paragraph that talks about that. The second thing to think about is that information sentences must include a source. That source could be you, in the sense that here's something I experienced, here's something I did, this happened to me. That's one kind of documentation. Another is a parenthetical citation or an indication of the author or the source in the sentence itself. And I'll show you some examples of that in a sample paragraph I have. Third thing, it's not a sequence. You may start with information and then have a topic sentence at the end. That isn't common, but it's possible. You may have an entire paragraph of analysis followed by a new paragraph with a topic sentence in it. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to do this. And the last thing to think about is that different readers might assign different labels to the same sentence. Let's get started. Oh, I'm sorry. We need to talk about documentation first. You document, again, is something I've said many times, and you guys all know this, words and ideas that are not your own. You use in-text citation system for the bookkeeping, and you use the minimum in-text citation information to convey where it comes from, because the maximum stuff is listed on the works cited page. That's why you never need to say in an article titled, Fred Smith goes to Hollywood from the New York Times, you never need to put that in a paragraph. And so you could just start with the author's name, Fred Smith points out, and go on from there. Because the title, the source, the date of publication, all that is in the works cited page, and that's where it should stay, particularly with a MLA. With MLA, you have one set of options here. You introduce the source with a signal phrase, Fred Smith, sociologist Fred Smith points out. That's all you need. And then you use the last name. Smith says, Smith argues, Smith discusses, he says, he argues, whatever. For APA, at the end of the sentence where the person appears, then you include the name of the author and the year and the page number if you have it. And again, I'll show you some examples of this. Why are we doing this? Avoids plagiarism, which is always an issue. although it shouldn't be, because you guys are all honest folks. You just make mistakes. It gives credit where credit is due and makes clear who wrote what. A lot of times students say, why can't I use I in a paper? And I always say you can use I if you're talking about yourself, but if you're expressing an idea, instead of saying I think, use a verb that's going to indicate that this is your analysis, not that it's a fact. We know that also because we assume that any sentence that doesn't have documentation of any kind is yours. Okay, that it's your thinking, your ideas, your data. Okay. Last point about documentation, any summary, any paraphrase, any quotation must be documented. I've had students say, well, if I paraphrase that, I don't need to document it. Oh, yes, you do, because the ideas are not your own. They're ones that you get from a source. Let's move on. I've got 4 sources here, and I'll show you how to integrate these 4 into a paragraph. The first one is an article by Richard H. Thaler. It was published in the New York Times. You can see that by the Times symbol up here. Here's the date, June 21st, 2013, and here's the title, Breadwinning Wives and Nervous Husbands. This is an article about marriage. Note that it's an online source, so it doesn't have page numbers. So this is my first source, Thaler, 2013, Breadwinning Wives and Nervous Husbands, New York Times. I have 2 sections of this that I'm going to use, and I've highlighted those sentences. Women earnings have been rising relative to men. And then it isn't surprising that when a wife earns more than her husband, the risk of divorce rises too. And I have some data from that. Number 2 source is actually 2 different sources written by the same person, both by Derek Thompson, both published in The Atlantic, one published in 2013 and one published in 2012. Both of these articles are about marriage. One is called How America's Marriage Crisis Makes Income Inequality So Much Worse, and the other, as you can see, is The Death and Life of Marriage in America. Both of these are by the same author, but they have different titles and different publication dates. You need to know that for documentation. They're both online sources, so again, we don't have to worry about page numbers. I've got 2 sections that I've extracted from. One is this paragraph that comes from How America's Marriage Crisis, about how college graduates are more likely to marry other college graduates and high school graduates are more likely to marry other high school graduates. So in other words, people don't marry up and they don't marry down. They marry across the same socioeconomic group. Here's from the second source, The Death and Life of Marriage in America. This talks about the marriage rates and the divorce rates of people based on economic class. If you're college educated, you're more likely to get married and stay married than you are if you're a high school graduate or a high school dropout. And that's the content of this little paragraph that I've highlighted. This is the 4th source I have. It's from the Pew Research Center. It's another online source, so no page numbers. It was written in 2014. The authors are Lopez and Ana Gonzalez Barrera. The title is Women's College Enrollment Gains Leave Men Behind. And you may have noticed this in your own college careers, that there are more women students now than there are men, and that this has been increasing over time. As you can see down here, for white women, in 1994, 66% of college students were women. Now it's 72%. Okay. For men, it stayed roughly about the same. Women have increased and men have shrunk a little bit. Same thing, this is high school completers enrolled in college. That's where these numbers come from. It's not the absolute percentage of all these folks, but you can see that there are more women going to high school in every ethnic category, in Hispanic, in Black, in white, and in Asian, than men. And so the number of men total are beginning to decline in college, and the number of women are increasing. So what does this mean? It means there's more women college graduates than there are men college graduates. So who are these guys going to marry? That's an interesting question. We'll see that in a paragraph. So anyway, I've got 4 different sources, all about the same issue of marriage, all about how education and socioeconomic class make a difference in whether you get married and how long you stay married. Well, let's see what a paragraph would look like with all this information in it. I know I'm going really fast, but bear with me. So here's my paragraph. Here's my topic sentence. Marriage is one of those institutions we tend to take for granted, but it is under a variety of pressures today. This is entirely me, okay? I didn't get this idea from any place else. I'm just older. I've been looking around. I put it in blue because these are my words. This is my topic sentence. The topic is marriage, and it's an issue. It's an area under stress. We all kind of know that. Okay, here's my restriction. I'm going to talk about the role of women in marriage. Women in particular have driven some of these pressures due to the many changes in their status in our society. So these two sentences are in blue. These are entirely my own thinking. If it's red, it's an information sentence that comes from my research. So here's my first source. Economist Richard Thaler, credential, name of the author, points out that in the last 4 decades, women's income has increased, though it is still less than men's. Okay, I only need to say his name. That'll take me to the source because I don't have any page numbers. So I don't need a little parentheses thing here at the end with P dot whatever for the page number because there aren't any. So if you don't have page numbers, don't make them up. My second information sentence comes from the same source. There are many couples where the wife out-earns the husband, and he asserts, he refers to Thaler, this may explain why there's a higher divorce rate in such couples. That's all I have to have because I've named the author, I refer to him as he here. In support, he cites, Richard Thaler, a study that shows the divorce rates for such couples is half again as much as those where the wife makes less than the husband. And that kind of stands to reason. If women are wealthier, they have more options. They don't need a man to support them, so they don't need to stay married as long. Okay. So that's one source. And you see I've got 3 sentences out of it, and I've accounted for it with his name and 2 pronouns. That's all I need. I can go to the works cited page. I'll look for the word Thaler. I can see the author. I can see the title. I can see it comes from the New York Times. I can see the date. So I can leave all that crap out of here. Again, documentation in a paragraph should be as simple as you can make it. Here's my second source. Business Reporter, credential, Derek Thompson, reports that because of income inequality, wealthy people tend to marry wealthy people, and high school dropouts, other high school dropouts. Which of the 2 articles? I use a short title. How? Because remember, I got 2 articles by the same guy. They also tend to stay married longer, he points out. This comes from the second article, Death and Life of American Marriage. So you can see how I've accounted for them. Okay, he refers to Thompson. Article title, short title here, both written by the same guy. If I go to the works cited page, I look for Thompson, and I see these 2 articles. Real simple. So, okay, so what does this mean? So this is Mike Burke talking. And I put it in blue just so you could see it easier. In your paper, all this would be black, of course. Clearly, as women's earning power and educational levels have risen, it makes less sense for women to marry into a stereotypical traditional marriage where the wife stays home and the husband works. Second analysis sentence, they have other options, such as continuing their education or professional career, and they may even choose to have a child or children without marrying, since it seems the social stigma previously associated with such choice is largely gone. Now that's me. Not everybody would agree with that. Okay, and notice the verb that I use, seems. I don't say the social stigma is absolutely gone. It's an opinion, okay? It's not a fact, okay? And here I have some information and analysis in one sentence. Their lower educational attainment. This is men. Women now outnumber men for the first time in our history, 55-45, according to a recent Pew study. That's that 4th source I showed you. I have their authors' names here, Lopez and Gonzalez Barrera. Suggested in the future, women may very well be calling the shots. And that may well be is a conditional verb, so we know it's an opinion. So here's my conclusion. Whether this is just an evolutionary or truly revolutionary change in our society's view of itself remains to be seen. Again, that's an opinion, but here it's just the last sentence in a paragraph, and that's my opinion again. So I don't need to say, I think, or I don't know if this is a revolutionary or evolutionary change. I don't need to use I here. I can just do it with the verb. So again, to recapitulate, the blue sentences here are all yours. You own the topic, the restriction, the analysis, and the conclusion. Red, material from sources, all of which are paraphrased or summarized, those are information sentences. Every information sentence has some indication of a source. The name of the author, a pronoun referring to the author, a shortened version of the title if I've got more than one article by one author. So you can see I've accounted for those sentences. I've even introduced my 4th here at the end. The Pew study that I showed you at the very last slide there, and I just refer to them by the 2 authors' last names, and I tell you where it came from. Okay? Is this the best model for a paragraph? No. It is a model for a paragraph. As you can see, this is a long paragraph with a lot of information. If I were putting this into a paper, I might think about breaking it in half. and I might break it right here between the last piece of information and the first piece of analysis. I might break it here. This would be paragraph 1. This would be paragraph 2. Or I might leave it as 1. It's all up to you. You decide what you think your audience can stand. My purpose in this particular example is to show you how you can integrate a source without a tremendous amount of documentation apparatus, and how you can make clear what's opinion and what's fact. If it's a fact, you have a source. If it's opinion, you don't. You also indicate opinion by the verb choices. Seems to, may be, could possibly. You use these conditional verbs to indicate that these are opinions and not facts. Okay? So now that you've seen this, we should be able to do this on our own. Okay? This is the same paragraph done in APA format, and you can see the rules are a little bit different. For each time you refer to a particular source, instead of getting away with a pronoun, you've got to name the source. Thaler 2013 up here in the first information sentence, Thaler 2013, Thaler 2013. I can't get away with just a pronoun, okay? Down here, because Thompson's 2 articles have different dates, I can distinguish them by Thompson 2012 and Thompson 2013. With Lopez and Gonzalez and Barrera, I also put in a date. I don't say it's a Pew study. I just indicate the authors, and then you go to the references page and you'll figure it out. This is exactly the same paragraph. It's just documented differently. If you choose MLA, you can make it sound more like regular sort of standard English sentences. APA, you've got to follow their system, which makes you have to account for each source in each sentence with the same parenthetical thing if it comes from the same source. You can't get away with shortening that. So you can see you repeat it 3 times. Okay? Final thoughts. Don't quote facts. Paraphrase them. Never put a sentence in there that says 16 out of 25 people said X. You can paraphrase that, put that into your own words. 3/4 of people who responded said X, and that would work just fine. If you mention a source, don't just quote their conclusions or assertions, okay? Include some of their data, which is kind of what I did with that 55-45% thing from Lopez and Gonzalez Barrera, okay? When you're choosing sentences to include, when you're choosing facts to include, look for ones with the most impact. What do you think is going to affect the audience the most? And then go back to chapter 5 if you have questions about this, and take a look at the relative value of evidence types. And that will help you what to decide. Take a look at the sample student papers that are in Blackboard. Take a look at the quote sandwich handout that's in Blackboard, and the other materials that I've put in there on integrating sources. And good luck with this process. This is not easy. This is really where editing and revision really plays a very important part. Thank you for your attention.